from the Minnesota Ag Water Resources Center, which is where Discovery Farms is housed in Minnesota. What we wanted to do with this final panel of the day is, we've had lots of opportunity to hear from different researchers and different things that are going on within the state, and try to apply that to our individual situations. And what, over the last basically 2 years, there's been lots of talk in Wisconsin about nitrogen, and specifically a lot of talk about a potential standard that would focus on reducing nitrate loading that would be added on to the NR 151 standard. And so, the way that that unfolded and the recommendations that came forth and all of the people that were at the table for that is pretty similar to the processes that have gone on in Minnesota over the past few years. And so we thought it might be helpful at this juncture in the process to just hear from our partners in Minnesota about, where they're at with the rule that they have. We've got a couple of different perspectives represented here, and just sort of figure out, like, okay, learning from what our state has been discussing for the past year or 2 years, what's already happening in Minnesota, and just like taking a whole bunch of perspectives into account. How could we fathom moving forward from here? What could we take forward? What looks like progress? And how can we do that together? So with that, I'll let Warren introduce himself and the panel and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Amber, and I appreciate the introduction. So the Minnesota Ag Water Resource Center is an ag environmental organization made up of all of the commodity and general farm organization groups in Minnesota. And so we've been together for almost 15 years now. And my primary role is working on water issues, advocacy, policy, and that sort of work. But within our program, we recognized early on we needed to do the kind of work Discovery Farms does as well. And so we started our Discovery Farms program back in late 2009, early 2010. And as Amber mentioned, we've been very lucky to be partners with Wisconsin, and we've learned a lot from that effort. It's been alluded to this afternoon. I appreciate the kind of gentle introduction of the potential for nitrogen regulations in Wisconsin. We're living with that in Minnesota already. We've been through a process over the last several years. And so this afternoon, we've got a panel that will talk about that process, how we got here, kind of the detail of what's in our groundwater protection rule, and then hopefully have time for you guys to ask us some questions. We're going to start our panel this afternoon with Margaret Wagner. Margaret is the fertilizer non-point manager within the pesticide and fertilizer division of our Department of Agriculture. And so her program, she has oversight over the Department of Ag's water quality related research programs and other activities, which include our Discovery Farms program. They're our partner in that effort, and includes being the group that is responsible for implementing the groundwater protection rule. So I've asked if Margaret would give an overview and let us know kind of the detail, the nuts and bolts of what is in the rule to set the table for what we're going to talk about the rest of the afternoon. So Margaret.
Great. Hi, everyone, virtually. I hope everyone's having a great conference, and thanks for the invitation. Again, my name is Margaret Wagner. I'm a manager at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And Warren and Amber asked me today to talk about the groundwater protection rule in Minnesota, provide some background, explain what the rule is, where it's being implemented, and some of our current activities. I'll take about 15 minutes or so to work through that. Our intention is to leave lots of time on this panel for discussion and conversation following all of our presentations. Advance the slide. Just a moment, I'll advance the slide here. And yeah. So I quite often start this presentation with an acknowledgement that nitrogen loss under agriculture is a challenging issue with no single or simple solution. So some nitrate leaching will occur under normal row crop production. Much of this is really driven by weather conditions. So we know that under seasonal or excessive precipitation, some nitrogen losses can occur, especially in those vulnerable areas of our landscape. So one problem or challenge is really that there's lag times associated with this. So the time between when practices on the landscape take place and when we see a response or a change in that water quality. In certain areas, this response time or lag time can be really rapid, and we can see a response as we change practices on that land surface. And in other geologic settings, it can be much more complex, and we can see it take even decades to see that response. But what we do know is that nitrate can be lost below that root zone, and this is a challenge that we really face together in agriculture. So what I'll present today is a strategy in Minnesota to meet our goal to minimize potential sources of nitrate contamination in groundwater and together protect our drinking water. And our approach here in Minnesota is to really target those areas that are most vulnerable to groundwater contamination, or where there is an existing elevated level of nitrate, or where we already have concerns or a problem with nitrate. So a little bit of history here. The Department of Agriculture developed the Nitrogen Fertilizer Management Plan as the state's blueprint or strategy to minimize impacts to groundwater. This Nitrogen Fertilizer Management Plan, or NFMP, it was first developed in 1990, and that was the result of the 1989 Groundwater Protection Act. And then it was revised in 2015. And during that revision process, it was quite extensive. It took multiple years, and we got a lot of input on that process. And the goal of the Nitrogen Fertilizer Management Plan is to involve the agricultural community in problem solving at the local level to address localized concerns around nitrate in groundwater. And really the keys to this management plan are to encourage and promote science-based practices to reduce nitrate. And there's a focus in this plan and in the groundwater protection rule on the University of Minnesota's best management practices, or the nitrogen fertilizer best management practices. As I've mentioned, it's to target those areas most vulnerable to groundwater contamination, and it's to work with farmers and crop advisors to problem solve. And the development of this strategy and plan in Minnesota was really foundational as we work towards the groundwater protection rule. And these key elements that I've identified here are also key elements in our rule. So moving into Minnesota's new groundwater protection rule, it went into effect in 2019. And the rule applies to the use of commercial nitrogen fertilizer in Minnesota. It does not apply to manure. It focuses on protecting groundwater. And as mentioned, it went into effect in 2019, and it contains two parts. So there's separate criteria and elements to the two parts of our rule. And that's what I'll spend most of today's presentation on, is going into some detail of how the rule works and where it applies. And before I go there, I'll quickly highlight maybe a timeline to just illustrate that this was a multi-year process. So this didn't happen quickly, and it certainly didn't happen overnight. There is a lot of text on this slide, and much of it is about an administrative process that developed the rule. But what I would really like to emphasize, and what I've bolded, is both the timeline, that there were multiple years of work here, and the points, the multiple points where there was informal and formal comment periods. So just quickly, really the development of the rule was started with listening sessions all over the state. So really getting input in that process very early and often. And as you'll see, there were different steps in the process for administrative hearings, as well as opportunities for informal as well as formal comment. And I think I speak for everyone that was involved in the development of the rule. This input and public comments were really important and instrumental as we saw the final rule developed. So with that, the groundwater protection rule, as mentioned, has two parts. I'll talk about part one first. And part one is about nitrogen fertilizer restrictions in the fall and on frozen soils. And those restrictions do apply in areas with vulnerable groundwater. And they went into effect for the first time in September 1st of 2020. And that fall fertilizer restriction goes into effect now every year starting September 1st. So as you can see in the map illustrated on the right, those areas in purple is what is considered areas with vulnerable groundwater. Overall, that accounts for about 13% of cropland here in Minnesota, and that's an estimate. So when we talk about vulnerable groundwater, that's defined as areas of the state that have coarse textured soils, shallow bedrock, or karst geology. So that's what's illustrated here on the map, and again, highlighted in purple. And that vulnerability rating is determined by the quarter section. So if half of the quarter section has those characteristics of vulnerability, then the entire quarter section is included with the restriction. And we have a zoomable interactive map on our website. And that we do receive a lot of calls, both from farmers, landowners, retailers, and others to walk through the map. So as the rule went into effect, these restrictions went into effect, we actually walked through this map and had people look at all their fields and where they were. And so this has been an effective communication tool to know exactly where the rule applies in Minnesota. So with that, I'll just mention, I can't go into all the detail today in a quick presentation, but there are exceptions to the rule. So that fall fertilizer restriction in those areas, there's exceptions when fertilizing winter grains or pasture, fertilizing for perennial crops, grass seeds. And again, we'll just refer back to the University of Minnesota's BMPs when applying any of those exceptions. Additionally, there's exceptions for applying MAP and DAP in the fall and when for other kind of academic and research purposes. So those are all described in the rule and on top of the description I have. So as I move into part 2, that's big picture. That kind of summarizes part 1 of the rule. I think a quick update, as mentioned, it went into effect in 2020. We, at this point, have not received any complaints about fall fertilizer applications in those restricted areas. And we have not had any follow-ups or investigations based on that. So right now we don't have any complaints. So we feel that this is being followed, and this is something that farmers in many cases were already doing. So encouraging those practices. As I move into part 2 of the rule, I'll start with a quick definition. We often use an acronym for that we refer to as DWSMAs, and that's we're talking about drinking water supply management areas. And essentially that is the area of land that's contributing to a public water supply or a community's water supply. And as you can see on this map, those areas are delineated by the Department of Health. And in the blue, you'll see a wellhead protection area, which I think most people are familiar with, again, that contributing area to the well. And in Minnesota, the boundary of that wellhead protection area is taken out to identifiable features like roads and other things, and actually kind of squared off, as you'll see in the green. So the groundwater protection rule in part 2 applies to that entire green area, or the area that's designated as that drinking water supply management area around the well. And that's important as we kind of really talk about where we're implementing the rule and how we implement it. So part 2, we're really focused on responding in communities where there's already elevated levels of nitrate in groundwater. And the key here is to take action before the public water system reaches that health standard of 10 milligrams per liter or 10 parts per million. So we want to take action prior to reaching that threshold. We want to work with farmers and local agronomists to implement practices that reduce nitrate. The rule really focuses on the promotion of the university's nitrogen fertilizer BMPs. And we strongly kind of advocate and encourage the use of what we refer to as alternative management tools, but those are just those practices that farmers can do that go above the nitrogen fertilizer BMPs to protect groundwater. Some good examples of what we will consider alternative management tools that can substitute for our nitrogen fertilizer BMPs are use of precision agriculture, vegetative cover practices like cover crops and perennials, on-farm trials, as well as taking targeted areas out of production or field swapping. So those are some of the practices that would also be promoted. And we've also created a high priority for state implementation funding. And what that means is we're working with our partners so that as we promote additional practices and work with farmers to think about changes on the landscape, that we can also support that with funding. So there is funding for implementation here in Minnesota, and we're trying to coordinate all of that. So we're targeting these areas that are the highest priority. So big picture, the groundwater part 2 of the rule has 2 levels. 2 of those are voluntary and 2 are regulatory levels under the rule. We'll always start in a voluntary level. And the rule only becomes regulatory if best management practices are not adopted on 80% of that area within that drinking water supply management area. So 80% of those acres adopting the BMPs is our goal. And that's excluding the soybean acres. So if those BMPs are not adopted, that's one way that we could move towards a regulatory level. And the other is if the water quality continues to get worse in that public supply well. And key to this step is really working with local advisory teams to identify those practices, implement and promote those practices. So this is a graphic that illustrates kind of what I just described. And again, there's 4 levels of the rule. The criteria is really that nitrate concentration in the public supply well. So you can see here on the left side at a level 1, that's 5.4 milligrams per liter of nitrate or greater. And then as you move into a level 2, that's less than or equal to 8 parts per million or greater of nitrate within the public well. So again, we'll always start on the voluntary side of this chart. And that's where we are here in Minnesota today. So a review of where the Groundwater Protection Rule Part 2 applies in Minnesota. I have a map here that illustrates kind of different colored dots, the significance of that. So the yellow dots indicate a level 1 mitigation. So again, we have elevated nitrate at a level between 5.4 and 8 parts per million in that public well. That would fall under that level 1. Level 2 is where we have exceeded 8 parts per million in the last 10 years. And that's important to mention. We get all of the public supply water data from the Minnesota Department of Health. They share that data with us. And so it is the department's is the Department of Health's data that indicates, these different levels due to routine testing, and they would be introduced in the rule when they meet this criteria. So again, we have 6 level 1 DWISMAs, 17 level 2 DWISMAs. So that means, again, areas with elevated nitrate above 8 parts per million. And then there's 13 areas that need more information. And most often that indicates where we are at a step in the process where we do a point source review, and it's required that we would identify any potential point sources and essentially eliminate them or rule them out that they're contributing to the sole source of that elevated nitrate. So during that process, it is a formal process of a point source review, and often that means additional investigation and may leave a DWISMA needing more information prior to that level determination. So the key kind of first step as we work in level 2 DWISMAs is to form a local advisory team. And this is just critical to the implementation of our groundwater protection rule. The fundamentals here are to work with this team of primarily local farmers and advisors. We also have some very key partners that participate on these teams, keeping them small and focused on developing a list of BMPs that are most appropriate and applicable for that DWISMA. So we are in the process. I'll give a short update about where those teams have been formed. So that covers kind of the big picture of the rule. What I wanted to also mention is there is the framework of the groundwater protection rule and working to implement it. We're also doing a lot of work on behind the scenes on the science. We do computer modeling to really understand what practices will get the best reduction in nitrate in these areas. We also invest a lot in demonstration sites. So working to demonstrate the University of Minnesota's recommendations and look at those actually in on-farm conditions. We're supporting University of Minnesota Extension educators to really help with outreach and education, supporting the irrigation specialist, and looking at other gaps that may be around BMP development and promotion and trying to address those gaps. This kind of emphasizes a few more activities here, but just to say, we do have some research and on-farm demonstrations projects and really thinking about those gaps and addressing them as we go forward. And then to summarize this, the MDA, where we are in the rule is we are developing local advisory teams. So we are actively working in a number of our level 2 drinking water supply management areas with groups of individual farmers and crop advisors. COVID restrictions in just the last 2 years has stalled quite a lot of this work. I'll say we're about 1.5 years behind where we would be. just using a lot of common sense and good advice from partners, we were not going to initiate local advisory teams with new partners in a virtual setting. So we really waited till a lot of the restrictions for COVID were over. And we know that these conversations happen best in person in small groups. So we are really waiting for the opportunity to get together while doing a lot of virtual outreach. Forming the local advisory teams, we waited till we could get together in person. And then many partners are working together. We have other state agencies that are prioritizing funding for implementation. And then I'll finish by saying they're just great examples of how our local leadership and partnership within these areas. So we work side by side with local soil and water conservation districts, counties, and other partners to implement this rule. And in many areas, they've been working on this for a while. So we are very supportive of the work that we do, and we really want to stand up those efforts and build on our local partnerships. And that's what I had prepared. So thank you. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Very good. And thank you, Margaret. That was a great introduction. And I'm sure there'll be questions. I've heard those slides in that presentation dozens of times and still learn something every time. And so many of you are hearing it for the first time. And so I'm sure you'll have questions, but we're going to hold those. Next, I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Jake Wildman. Jake's about 350 miles northwest of us, up in the Alexandria, West Central Minnesota area. And Jake is a farmer, precision irrigation technology whiz, and also the current president of our state's Irrigators Association of Minnesota. And so the trade organization that represents Minnesota farmers who use irrigation. So I'd invite Jake to give some comments.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Warren. That was a pretty generous introduction, I would say, but I appreciate it. No, I thank everybody for getting this opportunity to join you today. I guess I'll just kind of give you from a farmer's perspective how the rule has, I guess, affected my farm. About 2/3 of our ground is on the restricted area. We've got 2/3 irrigation, 1/3 dry land. So when we saw the rule as being developed, we looked at it from, kept an eye on it, but wasn't too concerned of what was going to come from it because of the fact that we were kind of incorporating those BMPs that the University of Minnesota laid out already on our farm. So it wasn't a major change for us. I think the department did a great job of getting input from different areas and keeping it local and not a one size fits all throughout the state, because what works in my area might not work in another area. So they were very good at keeping it very local. And I thought that was I give them credit for that. Other than that, like I said, by allowing MAP and DAP to be applied, that was important because of the fact that we know there isn't a phosphorus source that we can use, that nitrogen doesn't come with it. So there's ultimately going to be some nitrogen that would be have to be put out in the fields in the fall if we did some fall fertilizing on our fields. But yeah, other than that, like I said, it didn't impact our farm a lot, which was good. And I think they left the rule very flexible. What I mean by that is that we could incorporate other practices. I know on our farm, we've done more and more cover cropping every year. We found ways that we can incorporate them. And so being an alternative practice, that's a good way that we can, another thing that we can incorporate along with the BMPs, that hopefully we're doing the best job that we can. And I personally feel that as a farmer, we're always looking to improve. We're never, we're never at the top of our game. And if we can always get better, I think we're willing to do that. And as long as we can keep that balance, that economic and environmental in balance, and not one outweigh the other. So, but no, other than that, like I said, I look forward to the questions. But from my perspective, it's a good rule. It's an important rule, and I think we all have the same mission of protecting groundwater, and I'm glad we can all work together to try to accomplish that. So.
Very good. Thanks, Jake. And our third panelist, I'll introduce Jill Trescott. And Jill is the Senior Groundwater Advisor for Dakota County. Dakota County in Minnesota, it's that area, it includes the very southern suburbs of the Twin Cities metro area, and then extends south and east all the way over to the Mississippi River. So you've got some very densely populated areas, and then you've got a lot of agriculture in the south and especially the east part of the county. And I've gotten to know Jill over the years as she's worked on groundwater issues in that area. So Jill, take it away.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks a lot, and thank you for including me in this conference. I really appreciate it, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I'm sure it's a lot of fun. As Warren indicated, Dakota County it's considered part of the Twin Cities metropolitan area, and it has a big population. We have a population of about 400,000 people, but the county's kind of an odd duck because half of our land area is still in farmland, and that's about 300 square miles of farmland. And the county is also highly dependent on groundwater for its water supplies. Both people who are on city water and on private wells, are all using groundwater for their water supplies. We have very sensitive geology in terms of groundwater contamination. We've got a lot of coarse textured soils, so sands and gravels and karst. And I think we're quite similar to the central sands in Wisconsin as far as that's concerned. Almost all of our agriculture in terms of acreage is in corn and soybeans. We have almost no feedlot operations in the county. I suspect that's because we are so close to the metro. But in addition to corn and soybeans, we have sweet corn and peas and beans that are grown for processing facilities. In addition, we have nursery operations where they're growing trees and shrubs and perennials, and also sod for our suburban populations. But going back to the agriculture, in addition, as I said, a lot of our land area is still in agriculture, and the growth patterns in the county seem to have stabilized. So it looks like it's not like we're going to get built out anytime soon. And related to that, we are the second highest user of crop irrigation water in terms of counties. We're the second highest user in the state. The city of Hastings is right on the Mississippi River, and it is one of those municipal water supplies, one of those duismas that's highly impacted by nitrate contamination. They have a population of about 22,000 people who are impacted by that. And also the city of Hastings, because of ways that a smaller river, the Vermilion River, contributes to groundwater in the area, the city of Hastings has the largest drinking water supply management area in the state. It covers about 40,000 acres. Where lots of drinking water supply areas are, 1,000 acres here or 1,000 acres there. So we've got a big area to deal with. And in addition, the county has about 8,000 households that rely on private drinking water wells for their water supply. And of those, somewhere between 20 and 25% of them exceed the drinking water standard for nitrate. So it's been a longstanding issue for us. We've been very involved with the Department of Ag in addressing the nitrate issue, and Warren and I were both involved in rewriting the nitrogen fertilizer management plan, so it's something that we've all been working on, and working really hard to do this in a cooperative way, where that I think that all of us that have been involved with this have gotten better at listening to each other over time. So you don't just have drinking water people like me shouting in one corner of the room and farmers shouting in the other side of the room. I think that we're all committed to both improving water quality, but also maintaining the economic viability of farming in the area. In terms of the strengths and weaknesses of the groundwater protection rule, I think one of the things that it has really, there are several things that are improvements over what we've had in the past. The 1990 nitrogen fertilizer management plan had a lot of good ideas in it, and kind of laid out many concepts that we're still working from, but it really suffered from a lack of specificity, which is to say that there was a general sense that, oh, well, you know, we're all going to know what the problems are. We're going to know them when we see them. And then farmers are, you know, because farmers want to be as fertilizer efficient as possible. So they're going to address the problem and it'll kind of take care of itself. So it had a certain looseness in it, and so that was one issue. But an even bigger issue was that it didn't have any money for implementation, and that the state of Minnesota now has several dedicated pots of money to help agricultural. Well, they're not specific to agriculture necessarily, but that are helping with environmental issues, and so that's really made a big difference in how both agencies and local units of government can both do the science that we need behind issues and the planning, but also the cost share money that's going to make all this work in the long run. In addition, another thing that's been a real benefit of the revised plan and the rule has been the township testing program that the Department of Ag has initiated. This is something where they, on a county by county basis, they've been going around to the state to places that have a combination of a lot of agriculture, but also those vulnerable soils. And what happens is they identify vulnerable townships, and then every resident in that township is offered the opportunity to get their well tested for nitrate. And Dakota County was actually the first county to participate in that. It's been going on since 2013. It's statewide. The state has sampled more than 30,000 wells to establish where there are patterns of nitrogen contamination. That's in 300 different townships. In addition, as not related to nitrate, but now the Department of Ag is, if someone has nitrate in their well, the state is following up with pesticide sampling for in addition. So it's really been a remarkable program in terms of its scope and the kind of data that's being gathered, and it enables us all to get away from that, oh, we'll know the problem when we see it, because part of the plan is that any township that has more than 5% of its private wells exceeding the drinking water standard start to get into that mitigation area. And so there are another thing, as Jake touched on, is the local focus of working on what's going to work in one area which might not work in another. As I mentioned, for example, in our county we don't have a lot of livestock, so that's not a concern. And another thing is, because of our coarse textured soils, drain tiles are less of an issue here than they might be somewhere else. In terms of issues with the plan from a drinking water standpoint, the nitrate levels in an area they're just expected not to get worse. They're not expected necessarily to improve. And with an area that's as heavily impacted as Dakota County is already, that's really a problem. We in our area need things to get better. We have a couple of communities where in the township testing program, more than half of the households exceeded the drinking water standard for nitrate. So we, as I said, maintaining the status quo is not going to be good enough for our county. The fall nitrogen rule is a really good one, and if you looked at the purple areas of the map, almost all of Dakota County is in that vulnerable zone. But there's no we're dubious about if enforcement is going to be needed, how well that's going to be done. So we're in a wait and see mode with that. The rule itself really focuses on the drinking water supply management areas and on public water supplies. And so we're concerned about nitrate outside of the Hastings to Wisma, and we're also very concerned about private drinking water wells. And so that's something where we wish that the rule was stronger in addressing those issues. And we're not entirely comfortable with the way that BMPs are promoted, because most of the best management practices for corn fertilizer have really focused on what is the most profitable way of using fertilizer, and it doesn't necessarily look at, if a farmer follows this practice, is it going to keep the groundwater clean? And so we're concerned about the rigor behind the best management practices as they're promoted. So those really cover kind of that we think it's a big improvement on what we've had before, but we do have concerns about it. And I will also say that Dakota County on its own, because of our concerns with the plan, we're in the process of developing what we're calling an agricultural chemical reduction effort, or ACRE, and to address nitrate in the high levels of nitrate outside of the Hastings to Wisma, also issues with pesticides and with rising chloride levels throughout the county. So that's my whirlwind tour, and thank you for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Jill. Well, thank you all for that those introductions. We'll open it up now for questions. And as you get your questions ready, first I want to thank Jill. She could have mentioned that farmer yelling in the other corner was me. So thanks for not. I've learned too, and I think that's been one of the most productive things of this whole discussion, and that we've done over several years. Many of us started from one over here and one way over there. I think a lot of us have evolved and gotten to the point where this is a much more productive discussion than it was in the beginning. I think it's just human nature when a change is first suggested, you kind of push back a little bit, and then after bunch of discussion, and I think that's the path we've been down in Minnesota. And then I also want to just mention, I should introduce Larry. Larry Gunderson, you see his name pop up there because we included him. I neglected, I should have included Larry totally in the panel, and he's here. He's the guy that if no one else can answer a question, Larry will. Larry's with the Department of Agriculture, and his direct role is his responsibility for implementing the groundwater protection rules. So Larry, thanks for being on deck if we need you this afternoon. All right, do we have questions out there?
I have a question.
Yes.
This is for Jill. You mentioned pesticide screening. What pesticides have you been finding in the groundwater?
Jill, did you hear the question?
I did not.
Oh, sorry. So the question, Jill, is for you, and it's regarding what pesticides you've been screening for and finding in groundwater.
Excuse me. We have worked with the U.S. Geological Survey for about 20 years, and what we have been looking for is they are the herbicides that are most commonly used and most commonly detected in Minnesota groundwater, and also the breakdown products for those. And so those include atrazine, acetochlor, metolachlor, and alachlor are probably the ones that we have detected the most. As a whole separate issue for us is, there is a product called cyanazine, which has been off the market in the United States for 20 years. And what we have found in Dakota County is that we have cyanazine breakdown products at levels that are over the drinking water standard. So and we're now working with the Department of Agriculture because there are other parts of the state that it turns out have that issue. I will say we almost never find the parent compounds of any pesticide, including cyanazine, in the drinking water, but we do find lots of, we don't find the parent compounds, but we do find the breakdown products. And with the exception of cyanazine, we have not found them at levels over the drinking water standard, even the breakdown products. We're concerned because there's such a mixture of chemicals. And of course, we're very concerned about the cyanazine issue. That's not something we can address in terms of practices because no one's using it anymore. It's just a matter that it's a little freaky, for lack of a better term, of how persistent that's turned out to be.
Very good, thank you. Our next question. I'm not seeing one. Put your hand up if you need. Oh, we've got one over here. Thank you.
Jill mentioned some concern about rigor of BMPs versus the demands of the resource of concern, in this case, groundwater. What is happening on that front? I know one of our earlier presentations today said maybe BMP isn't the right term to utilize, but what's happening in Minnesota to address that concern?
Again, just in case you guys didn't hear it, the basic question is around the concept of BMPs. And as BMPs are being implemented, and even the question of should we call them BMPs if something new is out there and emerging and might become the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'd ask all three of you to chime in on what you see as the potential for current BMPs. Are they already being used and are they just not making a difference? Do you see things on the horizon for new BMPs and what's yet to come? And so maybe I'll start with Jill because the question was kind of asked resulting from some of your discussion about BMPs, but I'd like Margaret and Jake to weigh in on it as well. So Jill.
Thanks. Our concern, a best management practice for groundwater is actually defined in Minnesota law, and it's supposed to be something where the laws, the verbiage is very long and has lots of clauses in it. But the bottom line is that if a farmer follows that practice, then the groundwater will not become degraded as a result of it. And what we're concerned about is particularly that fertilizer rates that come out of the University of Minnesota may be too high because what they are looking at is what's the most economic return and not necessarily, and I have to tell you, it's really a pain to collect groundwater data on a field by field basis. It's great if you've got drain tiles, but if you've got sandy soils like we have here, it's a very difficult environment to do that kind of analysis on, and so I recognize that. So I think that the university, which works on a lot of our BMPs, has been really trying to address that, to be more careful that the BMPs really are doing what they're supposed to. My sense in the conversations that we have is that the farmers do adopt the BMPs, and so they ought to work. Because the farmers are listening to them and following them. That's my sense. And I'm going to say one more thing, which is that what we see in our area was that there was a steep increase in nitrate levels in the groundwater in the 1980s and 90s. But then starting in the early 2000s, the rate is still going up, but the rate of increase is slowing. And I take that as a real positive indication that it's not like we need to change everything. We just need to change a little bit more everywhere to get where we need to go.
Very good. Jake, what do you think of current BMPs and where we might be going?
So, how do I want to go about this? I think, so where we're at now, I think there's going to be some products that are coming to market that are either here or you read about in magazines or on the internet that there is some potential that we could, incorporate those. I'll give you kind of an example of what I'm getting at is there's a product that we started using on our farm, and it's been out for about 4 years, and it's called Pivot Bio. Pivot Bio has, to be honest, I have mixed results on it right now, but I tell the salesman, if anybody wants it to work, I want it to work because of my position as in the Irrigator Association and talking with lawmakers and agency people. And so what Pivot Bio is it's a product you put in furrow. And what they're saying is you can apply up to 25 to 40 pounds less nitrogen in season in corn. Their ultimate goal is to replace 100% of synthetic fertilizer moving forward. Now, if that's the case, this is an absolute game-changing product. I could see something like that being incorporated into it. Do I think they'll get to that? It's a lofty goal, but technology is an amazing thing when it works. So that's one example, but I could see them getting, I could see them incorporating products like that to improve them. Like I said, like Jill said, we do. I think most farmers do their best to try to use the BMPs as close as they can, because it is science-based data. It's got data that back it up that this is not only the best for at the economic side, but also the environmental side. So, but yeah, so I think, like I said, I see products coming down the road that could be incorporated into them into the future but these products need to work the way they say they're going to work in order for, I think, us farmers to adapt them. So.
Very good, thank you. And Margaret, you kind of alluded to some of this in your introductory comments, but the Department of Ag has a role both in working with the University of Minnesota and on the development of these BMPs, but also we kind of refer them as BMPs on steroids. They're technically called AMTs. Could you explain a little bit about the BMP AMT conversation that we've been having?
Yeah, great. So again, the Department of Agriculture does have statutory authority in Minnesota to develop and promote best management practices for agricultural chemicals. We work very closely with the University of Minnesota, supporting that research. The last time the BMPs were updated in Minnesota was 2008, and our nutrient management team is looking to update those where we have new science and new research. But kind of the take home is that these are based on research here in Minnesota. And in certain instances, we've even seen kind of a water quality component added to some of these demonstration sites to really look at that question about impact from a certain practice. So we're testing BMPs and again, working alongside the university. So in general, we think the BMPs are being followed. We think there's room for improvement around certain activities. We're identifying proper crediting for manure as an area that could benefit from maybe some updates in the science, as well as additional promotion and outreach. And so I think we really work to acknowledge kind of the role of the BMPs that are fundamental. And we also can acknowledge that in certain very vulnerable areas, BMPs may not be enough, that these are really critical areas with already elevated nitrate, and that might not get us to that goal of clean water. And in those areas, and again, in really focused and targeted parts of the landscape, we're talking about what other practices could go above and beyond those BMP recommendations. And as Warren said, we're talking about those on steroids. So these are our alternative management tools. And it's a very formal part of the rule. And essentially, when we talk about BMP adoption, so I talked about that as part of our evaluation. When we are evaluating the adoption of those practices, there is a process where actually these AMPs are alternative management. So let's cover crops, precision ag, they can substitute for the use of those nitrogen fertilizer BMPs. So we really want to promote them and fund these type of practices where we think we might not reach that goal of clean water with just agronomic management alone. So targeted cover crops, perennials, precision ag, those are some of the things we're talking about in addition to the BMPs.
Very good, thank you. Any other questions out there? Oh, back here? Or do we have one over here first? Okay, yes, sir.
Mainly a question for Margaret, I guess. In Wisconsin, the continual theme that comes up is when we over fertilize with nitrogen, a lot of that comes from animal waste, from our cattle, especially in the state. So when you look at that, how did Minnesota just decide to go forward with the nitrogen fertilizer strategy? And you know, our biggest issue here is if we're going to under credit, it's going to be from animal nitrogen. So what does Minnesota do about their livestock and of this component? And then you have to look at human waste too.
Did you hear the question, Margaret?
I think I heard most of it. How does the Minnesota rule address proper crediting for manure since it only applies to commercial fertilizer?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so the main way that the rule addresses manure is through the university's BMP for proper crediting. So if there is manure that is used alongside commercial fertilizer in a drinking water supply management area, then they must take proper credit for that manure that is applied and cannot exceed the agreed upon nitrogen rate for that drinking water supply management area. So it's really addressed through crediting. And additionally, you asked about human waste, I believe. And so we are very aware of, potential point sources within these areas. And so as part of that point source review, we would look for septic systems or even septic lines. And if there were any concerns about those incidents in the past, identified, leaking within the DWISMA. So we do consider that as well as the feedlots and the storage of that manure during our point source review. So essentially going through inventorying those type of activities and seeing if there's been any concerns or contamination indicated in the past.
Very good. Thank you, Margaret. And I would add, early on in the discussion, that question for us in Minnesota came up often too. Why doesn't this apply to manure? And there's really a very simple answer, that the Groundwater Protection Act, the Minnesota Groundwater Protection Act, which is the foundation of this rule, gives the Department of Ag the authority to regulate manure. Forget I ever said that. To regulate commercial fertilizer, but does not give them the authority to regulate manure. When that came out in the discussions, there were many who were very concerned then that manure was unregulated. But rest assured, our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency regulates manure in our state. And so NPDES requirements, manure management plan requirements, which account for things like rate of application and the like. So manure is covered and has been covered for many years in a different way. And I will say that the discussion on manure and those permits and requirements has evolved. And as a result of this discussion, where we've talked about groundwater and township testing and those sorts of things, so that we're seeing changes brought into our livestock permits by a pollution control agency, totally outside the purview of what we're talking about here today with the groundwater rule administered by the Department of Ag, that are more in line with it. And so I think PCA, Pollution Control Agency, is also paying attention and looking at manure in those areas. And so it's kind of, the whole team is moving down the field. We're just trying to keep track of the different players. Over here.
Thanks. Two questions. How do you determine whether a farm is complying with BMPs? And what happens when you move from voluntary to the regular?
Okay. Margaret, this one's specifically for you. Two questions. When you go into an area and evaluate for BMP compliance, how will you do that? And how will a farmer be deemed to be in compliance with BMPs? And then how would we move from voluntary to regulatory?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll start by answering that we're in the process of developing those lists of BMPs. So we have not gone to an evaluation, but once that BMP list for a specific area is developed, there'll be no less than 3 growing seasons. So no fewer than 3 growing seasons until we do a BMP evaluation. And that BMP evaluation will include going out and actually looking at records with individual producers. So again, we haven't been through that process. We have outlined that process, but will include looking at records around the management of those BMPs that were identified on that list. So that's how we'll conduct those evaluations, specifically in an area like Hastings, which is really large. And as mentioned, 60,000 plus acres in that area. That BMP evaluation will not be on every single acre. We will have a layout that evaluates kind of evaluates the practices across. Now we have other DWISMAs where there's 2 individual producers and less than 100 acres within that area. That BMP evaluation will look differently in those areas. Either way, we'll be reviewing records and looking for that 80% adoption on within the area. And then I think the second part of the question, how
Yes.
will we handle, is it about moving to regulation or how will we handle
So the
complaints?
second part, if you could just give us your elevator speech on how you're going to develop and implement workers.
Yeah, so specific orders within those areas that are regulated. So a big question is what type of practices will be required. And so again, we're starting with the BMPs, and then as we move into a regulatory, additional practices could be required if funding is available. So some of those practices will be record keeping, potentially participating in education and other events, or some land management options. Again, we'll align those with the university's recommendations, and we are not going to require anything that's lower than that university recommended rate.
Very
So
good.
again, we have some, examples in the rule, but those will be very specific to that area and what we think it takes to really address that localized nitrate concern.
Okay, thank you. Is there one last question for the group or from the group? Here we go, right over here. Down this way.
This is for Farmer Jake. Are the BMPs keeping up with the increased yields that you're getting from crops? And because of increased genetics and farming practices?
Hear that, Jake?
Yep. No, I'm glad you asked that question because I wanted to make sure I made a comment on that. There's definitely some fact that the current hybrids that we have today are kind of, that nitrogen uptake curve is kind of changing, and so I think they are. It's more so the timing, not so much the rate, but the overall timing is where I think we need to, we could make some adjustments to the BMP. We might be, I know I'm talking from an irrigation perspective where we have the ability to, put on nitrogen whenever we really want to, we deem necessary. So we kind of have that advantage, but I think the total amount, when you take all the credits in that we take our irrigation water credit, when you do all that and add it up, the BMPs are up to, it's just, I think more so the timing and when it's appropriate to, we could see some adjustment in it. So
Very good. And I would add, I think one other outcome of this whole conversation in recent years is that our University of Minnesota, and I would imagine Wisconsin is similar in that we had kind of BMP rates and guidelines for many years, and our nitrogen management team at the University of Minnesota developed those, and they became known as BMPs. They were really guidelines or starting points where, if you didn't know much about a particular field, here's kind of a number that might work. Now that these BMPs are kind of becoming regulatory and used in a regulatory way, the university researchers are paying a lot of attention to, are they the right rates? And they're talking much more openly about the fact that these rates are sort of midpoints of a whole bunch of data, and they may capture most fields, but they recognize that there's that really weird field out there that just needs more nitrogen, or really weird fields that don't need nitrogen. You saw some of that in Dr. Ruark's data today. There's some things we don't know. And so I think Jake's right. I think for most acres, most farmers, the BMPs we have are working and they're evolving to kind of keep up. But as you talked about this afternoon with some of the research that you've collected in your state, there's some things we don't know. So with that, we've got just a couple of minutes left. I would just ask each of our panelists if you've got just one or two quick snippets of anything you want to add before we sign off, or if you're happy. I'll start with you, Margaret.
Great. I'll just say thanks for the opportunity to talk today. If people think of questions, please email me at the Department of Agriculture. If I can't answer it, I'll ask Larry. And also that we have a lot of information on our website, recorded information, videos. And so If you look up groundwater protection rule, Minnesota, on Google, you'll get to our website, and hopefully that'll be able to answer lots of questions. And yeah, please follow up if you have any.
Jill.
I guess the two things that I would really highlight are, just as we've talked about, that it has to be a conversation among knowledgeable people, and not just people shouting each other and not understanding the other people's perspectives, because there's a lot of really good technical information that has to go into coming up with good rules. But there also just has to be a lot of listening, because there are a lot of different circumstances to be addressed. The other part of it is, I think that you have to take a hard look at money, because I think that what is eventually going to make this work in Minnesota is the available of cost share funding and incentives to hit that balance of, what we're seeing with soil health initiatives is that they make money for the farmers in the long run, but it takes a few years to get going on that. So there needs to be money added to the process to get people over the hump to doing what we need to. And so a source of, a great idea or a great rule isn't going to happen if it doesn't work economically. And so that's got to be a piece of it, is making the economics work.
All right, Jake.
Yeah, no, and I wanted to touch on one other thing that came along with this rule was Minnesota started a program. It's called the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has been I think the department will say that that's been a pretty successful program so far. And I'm glad they did that, because what they do is they basically take your practices that you have on your farm, and they give you a score. And if you're above a certain score, you get certified for the 10 years. And what that certification does is also, it's pretty much says that you're in compliance with future regulations, this current rule. So I want to give credit to the department there for starting that program. And because I think as farmers, I know we don't, me personally, I don't like being in the spotlight. I just like kind of doing what I do every day. But this kind of gives me an opportunity to get a sign to hang at the end of my driveway, and I take pride in that. And so I think that's a good program to go along with this rule. And I think by working together on this, it opens up different avenues for groups to work together to kind of, how can we do better as on our management side. I know the MDA here has partnered with local soil and water districts we have an irrigation grant from the NRCS, an RCCP grant. So that's kind of another deal where we look at, we have a groundwater protection rule. How can we get better at protecting that groundwater from an irrigation standpoint? Well, that's going to look at precision irrigation and how we can incorporate that into our best management practices. So a lot of things can kind of stem off this, this plan. And I think they're all for the better, and this technology is evolving, and we can continue to get better. So, but no, I just want to thank everybody for the time, and appreciate. Jill said, I wish I was out there too, but haven't been out to the Dells for a couple of years. But no, just thank you, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Very good. Well, thank you all for participating. Larry, thanks for being on hand. In case we got a really tough question. I want to thank Amber and the rest of the team here at Wisconsin Discovery Farms for